This video was made possible by ExpressVPN. Start browsing the web securely with 3 months free by going to expressvpn.com/MMI. Welcome to Meet My Inspiration. On this episode, I welcome Ryan Pyle. Ryan is a Canadian adventurer, TV host, speaker, and author. His television shows are broadcast around the world. Ryan's award-winning career is quite impressive. He rides motorcycles on epic journeys, climbs some of the world's tallest mountains, and documents it all as a very skilled storyteller. But the story of how he got to where he is today is equally as compelling as his many adventures. And now, please welcome Ryan Pyle. Okay, hi Ryan. Thank you very much for joining me on Meet My Inspiration.
Thank you for having me.
So Ryan, do you mind by beginning with telling us where you are at the moment? What are you up to?
So I've just celebrated my 100th day in Istanbul, Turkey. So obviously, I hope everyone out there is safe and healthy. And I was filming my Extreme Treks television series with BBC in Ethiopia in March when the world closed their borders. And I was up in the mountains and I was offline and I didn't know what was going on. And then when I got a signal, I realized that the whole world had closed and I wasn't anticipating that. So I was not able to get back to my home in Dubai because the United Arab Emirates had closed their borders. And so I ended up coming into Istanbul, Turkey, because they still had their borders open. And I know the city of Istanbul a little bit and it's lovely here. So I thought this would be a good place to kind of hide out. I did not think I would be here in July.
Yeah, it's been a long time. It's been a tough time for most people around the world, in fact. But how are you holding up? How are you doing there?
I'm doing great. I would say that my time in Istanbul has been defined by like three specific like moods. Like the first mood was definitely like fear, frustration, anxiety. That was maybe the first 2-3 weeks of living in a hotel in Istanbul, not knowing if I can go back to Dubai or not knowing if I should go back to Canada or what was going on really, just because I felt like the news was terrible and confusing. And then I kind of got through that stage and I went into my second stage and I felt like that was a little bit more creative. I started planning some TV shows and then I started doing my own kind of COVID calls. So I do these calls on my Instagram live and it's very interactive. People can ask questions and I interview all my friends and people I've worked with in the past or people I've wanted to get to know but didn't have the time. And I've done more than 80 of those now, almost one a day for 100 days. And just having like planning my own show, booking my own guest, and then promoting it has given me actually something to do. So instead of being out in the mountains and filming my TV show, I kind of made my own TV show that I could do from lockdown, and that has saved my life.
Yeah,
And then I guess now, have you watched a few of them?
I have.
Okay.
It's a cool concept.
Yeah, it's something, man. And then I guess the third stage is where I am right now, where I'm planning to leave. So my hope is that by the end of July, I'll be able to travel into Europe, and I've got a few business meetings and maybe even start filming again. If we can figure out social distancing and how to be safe, not only with my crew, but also with the people we'll interact with. So we're trying to figure all that out now.
Good. I hope it works out. The what did you call it? The COVID calls?
Yeah, the COVID calls.
So you said you've done about 80 of those, approximately one per day while you've been in quarantine. Do you think you're going to continue with that once you get out of quarantine? No.
No, I won't. I won't have the time, I hope. I mean, I love being busy. I love filming. You know, a lot of my TV shows, I'm offline for days and days and weeks. So I love that, being offline. But I definitely appreciate the community of people online who have been following me and tuning in. And maybe I can do one a week or something like that, but it'll be very sporadic just because I hope to be busy again. And I've just kind of been doing this because I haven't been able to travel.
And the name wouldn't quite fit.
The name wouldn't quite fit too. So no, my goal is to do 100 COVID calls, and I'll do the last one by myself and thank all my guests. And then hopefully I'll be able to move on from Istanbul and that'll be a nice end to it.
Good. And you're hoping to get back to work. So I think quite a few people who might be listening to this and watching this, you know, I'll of course give you an introduction at the beginning of the video, but could you kind of give a thumbnail sketch of what it is that you do?
So I make television shows. So I'm the host of a few television shows. One is called Tough Rides, where I ride motorcycles all around countries, and we've got Tough Rides India, Tough Rides Brazil, Tough Rides China. I make a TV show for BBC Earth called Extreme Treks, where I climb mountains and walk across deserts all around the world. And then I have another show on Discovery Channel called Expedition Asia, where I basically do really cool overland expeditions just in Asia. Um, and that's kind of what I do, and I love it. It's been a wonderful journey to get to kind of where I am, and I hope I'll be able to get back to work someday soon.
Well, that's kind of what I want to talk to you about is your journey. Um, to begin with, I guess I would encourage people listening to this and watching this to maybe go to YouTube, search your name, maybe Ryan Pyle, and you can find a ton of content there to kind of
Absolutely.
catch you up on all the exciting stuff that you're doing. But I want to know more about your background, before you had this adventurous life. So if you don't mind, let's go back a bit. And I do know a bit about your background, and I know that sports played a critical role in your youth. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so my father was in the 1972 Olympics. He represented Canada for water polo. So when I was growing up, my father really wanted to instill in my brother and I have a younger brother, just how important sports is and kind of the goals and lessons that you can learn about life through sport. And and he did that. And he never forced us to play a certain sport or never forced us to do anything too crazy, but he definitely wanted us to appreciate sport. And my brother and I really took to basketball. So I ended up being quite a serious basketball player from the age of like 8 to the age of 22, and even represented the University of Toronto for their Division 1 basketball team. So that was wonderful, and it instilled a lot of life lessons in me that I still value today, and helps me with my job and managing my team and my crew, and communicating with everyone, and trying to lead by example. I think that's all been crucial, and it's really who I am at the core, I think.
People who are deeply involved in sports in their younger years, they usually are motivated by their coaches to some degree. I know that you had a few coaches that made a big difference in your life. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, so I mean, relationships play a huge role in a young athlete's life, and it's wonderful if you can have the support from your parents, although that's not always the case. And then of course your relationship with your coach, and sometimes that becomes like a third parent, or someone else who you lean on, and and those relationships are crucial. So I guess my first really good coach that I had, who really took a liking to me and helped me develop myself as a player and as a leader, was Jacques Arsenault. So he was my coach at in my high school days at Lawrence Park Collegiate. So he really instilled in me this idea of leading by example, and just really how to play the game of basketball at a higher level. And that was wonderful. And I was with him for 2 years, and over that 2 years, I really elevated my game, and just the responsibility of being kind of the captain of the team, I suppose, as well. So I really appreciated all the work he put in, and it was a great relationship, and we're still friends to this day, although we haven't spoken in quite a while. Maybe I should definitely try to reach out. That would be nice.
Yeah. Is there
Yeah.
anything that you learned from Coach Arsenal that you still think about today? I mean, maybe something he said, a piece of advice that he gave to you that in certain situations it constantly comes back to you.
Yeah, um, I think that the being a leader on a team and having people look up to you to do things, is an important position, and it's something that you have to cherish and respect. And I think the thing that he really instilled in me is just consistency, like being a leader every day, not being a leader one day when you're feeling great and then handing it over to someone else when you're not up for it. And I remember sometimes, I would on defense or something like that, I would someone would go past me and score, And then I would look at him and he would look at me and he goes, no one else is going to stop that man except for you. Like, so step up or sit down. Right. Like, so, I mean, there's all these, it's like you have to step up and play every day and lead the team, whether, you're mentally ready or physically ready or not. And I just feel like that consistency level that he instilled in me was really important. And I try to use that even today, like with my filming, like I go out with these two amazing cameramen, Chad Ingram and Jesse Rosenberg. And, we walked 20, 25 kilometers across a desert for 10 days straight. And, I still think about Coach Arsenault and telling me, like, who else is going to do this trip? Like, these guys are filming you. You got to bring it every day and make sure that you're motivating them to go out on this amazing journey and helping them get the best footage we can and trying to put together the best show we can. And I just feel like those two things are seamless in my mind. And I don't know if it sounds crazy to someone else or not, but it's just it's the same process, really.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
That's good to have that kind of influence in your life. So back to basketball. You played basketball at the University of Toronto. You had dreams of going to the NBA. Unfortunately, it didn't work out for you. But
No.
at some point, your basketball career came to an end. And after playing basketball for such a long time, have it being such an important part of your daily life, what was it like for you when that came to an end?
Soul destroying. I mean, really. I mean, I think by the time I got to university, I kind of figured out I wasn't good enough to play professionally. So then I kind of twist my goals a little bit to maybe represent Canada and play for the national team. And I felt like that might be something that would be more feasible or more reachable. But I wasn't able to do that either. So when my career at university came to an end, I decided that I didn't want to like join a beer league or join a Sunday league for ex players or something like that. I really wanted to walk away from the game fully because I felt like I had given as much as I could and I was ready for the next chapter. And I just remember not having to practice for 4 hours a day or go to the weight room every day, go to the physio clinic every day. All of a sudden I had like 6-8 hours of my life back per day. And I had all this energy and I didn't know where to put it. And I guess at first you feel like depressed because you feel like you don't have a goal or you're kind of aimless. And I talk about this in a lot of interviews as well. Like when you grow up playing a sport like that, you don't really grow up very well-rounded. You don't have a lot of other interests or other hobbies because you spend so much time and energy pursuing your sporting career. So when I finished my basketball career, I really just had no idea what to do with my time and my energy. And luckily, I just decided that I wanted to try to go to China and do a trip. And because I'd taken a course in China in university, and it kind of sparked this interest. And I thought that I should, just grab a backpack and figure out what China was all about because I'd read a few, Jonathan Spence books, and felt like that's something that I should just do before I figure out what I need to do next. And then when I went to China, my whole life changed.
Well, we're going to delve into that because I've lived in China for a long time, and I've traveled around China quite a bit myself. But I think your experience was pretty unique. Now, what got you interested in China is you were studying international politics at university. I think you just randomly took a course on China and you got more and more interested, started studying more, as you said, started reading books. And then when you graduated from school, you decided to take this trip. Now, I'm curious, had you traveled much internationally and had you traveled at all alone like that?
No. I mean, I had a wonderful childhood. My parents took us skiing and stuff like that. So I was very fortunate to have traveled to the US and maybe to the west coast of Canada. And I went once to Europe on a ski trip. My dad took me on a ski trip with my brother. So we went to northern Italy and Switzerland and stuff like that. So that was really my only other international trip, was to Western Europe.
Okay.
Never been to Asia before, didn't speak Chinese, didn't know anyone in China.
What
So really,
what compelled you, this basketball playing kid from the suburbs and eventually from Toronto, to get on a plane by yourself and go to this extremely foreign place. What gave you the confidence that you could pull it off?
I was a basketball player. I can do anything. Like, no, I think like I've never been short on confidence. Like, I just feel like I'll figure it out. And I'm not afraid of the discomfort, of the pain, of how long it takes to figure something out. Like, I think, you go to China, you don't speak Chinese, you can't read or write Chinese, you're essentially illiterate. But I'll figure out how to eat, and I'll figure out how to take the train, and I'll figure out where the hotels are, and I'll figure out how to get to the sites I want to see. And it'll be exhausting and painful in some ways, but I'll figure it out. And that's kind of just what I did. And I've never been afraid of the process, no matter how daunting it might seem. I always feel like I'll either succeed and be victorious, or I will muddle through and somehow get by. And I've kind of just, but either way, I'm going.
Did anybody try to discourage you from doing that?
Everyone. That's how I knew it was such a good idea. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I base my idea value system on whether people think I'm nuts or not. So, like, I wanted to ride a motorcycle around China. People are like, that's ridiculous. That's dangerous. And then I told them I wanted to do it in India, and they're like, you're stupid. No, don't do that. So my value system is based on what other people think is insane. So yeah, going to China in 2001, I literally got on the airplane like a week after 9/11.
Uh-huh.
Obviously, the Twin Towers fell in New York City. It was a terrible time to be traveling internationally, but flights were still going, and I just felt like traveling around China is probably like a super safe place to be. And yeah, I just thought that I think I really needed a new challenge, and I think I needed a China-sized challenge. I think that's, like, looking back at it, that's probably the best way to describe it. Like, I knew going to China was going to be super hard and pretty uncomfortable, and traveling by public transport and not knowing anything. But I needed to, at that moment, I needed to learn something new, and I needed to learn how to travel in China, and I just set my mind to it.
Okay. Well, you did that. You started, I think, in Hong Kong, right? You flew
Yeah.
directly to Hong Kong. Um,
Not directly. I went through Alaska and Taipei and then to Hong Kong. I got the cheapest ticket possible.
right.
It took like
Indirectly.
28 hours or something like that. Yeah, exactly.
Well, you arrived at some point.
Yeah,
And you pretty much traveled to all the major areas of China. Eventually, you went out to western parts of China, where
yeah,
China and Pakistan have a border between each other. You did
absolutely.
all this alone. And I'm curious, you said you've never been short on confidence, but some of the biggest things, especially with sports, I guess, that you had done, you were a team player, you were part of a team. What was it like doing something so challenging by yourself, probably for the first time? What did you learn about yourself through that experience of doing it alone?
Uh, yeah, I learned that I really like being alone, and I'm really comfortable with it. And I think that that was something that I was missing, and I didn't know about myself. Because you're right, I was surrounded by teammates, from the age of 7 to the age of 22, and they were like family. Even though they changed over the years, and every year we were a little bit different, but the core group of guys stayed the same. And and I just realized like how much I like alone time, and how just relaxed I am being alone, and how nice it was not to have to motivate other people to follow me, or to wake up on time, or to practice harder, or whatever. Like, I didn't have to worry about anyone else. I just had to worry about myself. And if I felt like walking up a mountain that day, I would walk up a mountain. If I felt like sitting at a little cafe and watching people walk by the street like all day long, I would just do that. And I really enjoyed that freedom for the first time, and that was really special, and really nice. That first trip to China was incredible. It really was.
And you were traveling for about 3 months, I think, right?
Yeah, yeah. I came in. I landed in Hong Kong kind of mid-September, and then I left right before Christmas, and then I went home for Christmas, and then that's when I told my parents I was moving to China. And then I left back for China in January, and that was kind of it. And then that was January 2002.
So for people who might not be as familiar with China as we are, I mean, it's a massive country and it's so different from one region to the next. Um, the trip that you took, as far as I know. I mean, you pretty much went across almost every region of the country, and it varies culturally. And languages vary, which you might not have recognized at the time. It's a pretty epic journey that you took in a relatively short period of time. Did you have any negative experiences? I mean, I know you had some uncomfortable experiences, but did you have anything terrible happen along the way?
I wouldn't say terrible. Like, I mean, I was on Wang Fujin in Beijing, and someone picked my pocket and maybe got like 200 kwai, which actually was enough money for like 3 days back in
Yeah.
2001. So I was pretty pissed off about that. And then I stopped putting money in my pockets that didn't have zippers. Oh, I even had like a little money belt back in the day which went right under my pants, right on my hip, and then I just kept my money in there. So I learned a few lessons. One thing that happened to me that was super funny looking back is I actually got like detained or arrested. I was out at Siram Lake. So there's this gorgeous glacial lake up at like 3.5, 4,000 meters above sea level, very, very close to the border of Kazakhstan and China. And I was on the Chinese side of it. And I took this bus to this lake, and it was spectacular. And but I was like, you're only like maybe 20 kilometers away from the Kazakh border. So it's kind of like a high risk area, I guess, for a tourist to be. But I just started kind of trekking through the mountains around the lake, and I actually like walked onto a military base. There was no fence or anything like that, so obviously people like stopped me. Um, and then they kind of took me to this like home, which was also where the police officer in that area lived and worked, I guess. And he was a police officer, so they kind of made me sit there for 3 days, which was uncomfortable. No mobile phone, no email, no nothing. But they weren't going to let me go until they figured out who I was, and they thought I maybe had come over the border from Kazakhstan, and I didn't speak any Chinese. Um, but what they tried to tell me, I think, is that they were trying to find a translator. So it took them like a day and a half to find a translator. And then this woman who'd never spoken to a foreigner before, who learned all her English like watching movies, barely could speak English to me, but she was the English teacher in a village nearby, and she was asking me questions about where I had come from and all this stuff. And I had actually receipts of the hotels I had stayed in, like in Xinjiang, prior to that. Like I was in Turfan, I was in Urumqi, I was in all the basic tourist spots, and then eventually they let me go. So they didn't fine me or anything like that. But yeah, it was a little uncomfortable. Like it was, they were super nice guys though. They were just surprised that I'd showed up, and
They were
I
friendly.
was
They weren't trying to intimidate you or anything.
no, no, not at all. But they definitely couldn't let me go until they like filed their paperwork and just figured out what I was doing there. So, they went through my bag and stuff because maybe they thought I was smuggling drugs or I had weapons. And once they figured out I just had like a notebook with, my diary and a cheap little like Kodak, single
Yeah,
shot
the
camera,
instant one.
yeah, they let me go and moved on. But yeah,
Well,
it was a bit strange.
that worked out. That worked out well, I guess. Okay,
Yeah,
so at some point you made it into Tibet. I think there's a bit of a
yeah,
story that we're gonna go around that story, but it's quite interesting. But once you got to Tibet, you started to make your way towards the Mount Everest base camp. And when I say you made your way towards Mount Everest base camp, you basically walked for several days, I imagine, is how long it probably took you. 4 days.
yeah. Yeah.
That,
So there's the highway from Lhasa to Nepal is like the Friendship Highway or whatever. It goes like all the way you can drive from Lhasa like all the way to Kathmandu, right? So there's a highway that goes in and out of Nepal, and you just get on the road to basically south from Lhasa, and you walk and you go past Shigatse, which is the second biggest city, and then you go past Lhasa, which is the third city, and then just about like 30, 50 kilometers past Lhasa, that's where the turnoff for Everest Base Camp is. And of course, if you visit Everest Base Camp in 2020, you can drive right off the highway all the way to Everest Base Camp. But back in the day, you had to like hitch a ride on a truck and then stop at the right place. And actually, I remember in the guidebook I had, they listed the mile marker on the highway where you had to stop. So I was sitting in the truck and I would watch each mile marker go by. And then when it got we got to the one before I had to go, I was like, stop, 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 stop. And then the guy dropped me off right at the mile marker. And then that's where you start walking to base camp. And it was like 2 kilometers, and it took four days. And there were two 5,000-meter passes on the way. And it was pretty rough, but this was before there was a road.
Now I know you're not short on confidence, as you said, but
Sure.
that's a pretty bold thing to attempt to do. And it wasn't climbing season. There wasn't anything to see necessarily once you arrived there. You were just going to check out base camp and then turn around and come back, I guess, right?
Well, I mean, this is the thing. Like, was it uncomfortable? Yeah, sure. I mean, it was like November. This was one of the last things I did before I made my way back to Hong Kong and out. Like the trip to Tibet, and then I was pretty quick through like Sichuan, Yunnan, and southern China. But Tibet was really amazing. And like, you know, I had a guidebook, and the guy in the guidebook had told you like where to sleep, where to eat. Like once you get over this pass, there's a village. You stay at the village. Someone will, you know, you give them this much for a bed, you give them this much for food, they'll feed you. And then it's 20 kilometers to the next village, you know, and there's a path because the Tibetans do it. So you're not going to get lost. Like there's a trail, and then there was other Tibetan people on the trail, and then you just follow them, and then you see the house and you knock and you're like, hey, and they're like, yeah, come in. And, you know, you just do it. Is it daunting? Sure. You know, was it a tough walk? Yeah, for sure. Like that was, you know, the altitude there is intense. And that was my first experience with real altitude.
And then
it wasn't, yeah.
Once you finally got to Everest Base Camp, you had a little surprise waiting for you, I think.
Yeah, so there was this like, there were some military guys there that had come in like off-roading, yeah, in a big truck. And you know, there's off-roading trails all around Tibet, so there's ways to get places if you have the right kind of vehicles. But there were all these guys with these military guys taking pictures in front of Mount Everest. So and they you know, they had the Kalashnikov and, you know, the Chinese flag and something like that. So that was a bit strange to see at that moment when I, you know, finally did make it up to base camp. But there's a lot of Chinese military around there because of the border
Especially now.
area and stuff like that. Yeah, especially now. So yeah,
Pretty
so
unique
that
Everest
was a strange one.
experience.
Yeah, it was fun. And then I spent the night there at the Rangpu Monastery, which is the monastery at base camp, because there's monks that live there year round. And now there's a huge hotel and guest house, and it's totally different. But
Well, you're
I was
lucky
the
to
only
have
one there.
experienced it. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
it was nice.
your trip to China, this was kind of a life-changing 3 months, I think, for you. I think you
Yeah.
said you arrived into China still a boy and you left as a man. You went back home to Toronto, and you realized you had kind of a passion for discomfort, for being uncomfortable. You then, I think, you decided to return at some point, maybe several months later, to live in China. Your experience was so life-changing that you wanted to come back and live in China. You did that. You came back. You started off, I think, in Hong Kong for a short time, and then you made your way up to Shanghai, where, in fact, I met you in Shanghai.
That's right.
You were teaching English for a short time, as a lot of foreigners do when they come to China. And then you started transitioning to writing for local English publications. Catch us up on that a little bit. So you came to China, you're working in Shanghai, you start writing for local papers. Did you have a plan at that point?
No. So, I mean, you know, that first trip to China made me believe that I needed to travel for a living. Like that was like, I love this feeling of learning something new every day and meeting people and just traveling around. And I thought that the way to do that would be to write and take pictures, and that would get me the lifestyle or the career I was looking for. So when I went back to China and when I went to Shanghai, that was 100% my goal, is to figure out how to do that. And there's no roadmap for it, and everyone has a different career path. So so I went to, you know, the local expat magazines, which was like that Shanghai City Weekend, all these ones, and I told them I could write and take pictures, and I would travel around China, and they, you know, they had a set rate per word, and I showed them some samples, and they said fine, and then yeah, like this was, you know, the money was nothing. I was making much more money like teaching English, but I didn't want to do that. So I was able to teach English, and I had a roommate. So I was able to keep my costs super low. So I was able to like disappear for 2 weeks and go trekking in the mountains of Yunnan and come back with like 3 stories. And that was like, enough money for like a month or two. And then I would go out and do it.
You were probably funding those trips on your own, or was the publication paying for it?
No, I would fund them on my own, and then the
Yeah.
publication would pay me when I came back. So we had an agreement, like, oh, I'll get you these 3 stories, and they're like, yeah, we'll pay you when you finish them. And I'm like, great. So then I went out and did them, and that was how I built up a portfolio to use to get to, Cathay Pacific Airline magazine, South China Morning Post, Straits Times, Singapore, and then eventually New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Time, Newsweek, Forbes, Fortune. So it's like, it was just baby steps over the first few years of doing that.
How long did it take you when you first started writing and taking pictures and doing these stories? How long did it take you before you were able to support yourself exclusively as a journalist?
Well, I mean, writing for that Shanghai and City Weekend, maybe use the term journalism pretty loosely, but a traveler who also writes, definitely working on the craft and learning. Well, probably within 6 months, I only taught English for maybe 3 months. Um, and then I was self-sufficient. So I was really good at hustling. And again, like that's my basketball career. Like I'll work endlessly and put in the hours and try to do things, better, faster, higher quality than most people. I was super disciplined. I was up early in the morning. I was doing stuff, and I was able to turn content out, and people liked it. So I was very busy and I loved it, and I was learning a lot as I went. And then as I started kind of working in these circles, I started meeting the New York Times correspondents in Shanghai and Beijing, and I started learning about that next level of journalism work in China, and I got into that world, and I very much enjoyed that.
Well, let's talk about that world for a second. I think it was at the New York Times. You met a gentleman called Howard French, and I think that
Yeah,
Howard
changed my life.
exactly. Let's
Yeah.
let's talk about Howard.
Yeah, so I mean, Howard was the quintessential newsman. I mean, he went to journalism school. He did like 20 years in West Africa, sorry. He was in Japan and covered Japan and South Korea. And then he had a stint of 4 years, I think, at the New York Times in Shanghai, and set up the bureau in Shanghai. At that time, they only had a Beijing bureau. So he was he was someone who had just tons of experience, and I met him at a I met him, and then I decided, would he like to work together? And because he didn't have a photographer, like he was quite new, and at that time, like getting in with the writers was really important. Like you had to get along with the writers. So if the writer liked you and thought your work was okay, then they would suggest that either go to New York and pass the test in New York and meet the photo editors, or because this was before you could send email and before Instagram, and so you actually had to meet people face to face. And I actually had like a portfolio book, like a physical book that I would take around New York showing people. And yeah, I mean, Howard kind of took me in and started working with me, and I went to the Howard School of French journalism, which is
Well,
funny because actually now he teaches at Columbia.
oh, right. So
Yeah.
you did in fact have to go to New York and pass the test in order to work at the Shanghai bureau. Yes.
Yeah, so I definitely had to go to the New York Times office in New York and meet the photo editors and talk to them about my photography and kind of pass their little test. And then, which isn't a test, they just want to talk to you and look at your work. And then it was really the relationship with Howard and I where that work really blossomed. And he was great at finding stories and great at executing and interviewing people. And I just had to follow along and not get in the way and try to get the best picture to tell his story. And that was amazing. Like that was the New York Times. Like so with some of the other magazines, they would send me out without a writer, and I would do the pictures, and maybe the writer had already been there, and the writer would tell me to do this, and then I would go later without them. Sometimes that's an easier way to work, but the New York Times was always like writer, photographer together.
Mm.
And I love spending time with Howard, and we're still really good friends to this day.
Well, and you said that Howard has changed your life. I mean, that's a
Yeah,
big statement. Um,
sure.
how
He
exactly?
influenced me the way my coaches would have. I mean, he played the role of a coach. He took me under his wing. He taught me how to be professional at what I did, and taught me, how to be objective and how to be a journalist and how to find stories and all these skills that I still use today when I make television. And he put me on that next level of that next platform. Like, obviously I had to be a good photographer, and I had to have some skill, but he gave me that step up to have a career, like to have a real career. And not just be a writer for some expat magazines. Like, I was able to really establish myself in the world of journalism and photojournalism as being a top photographer, and that was amazing. I worked hard for it, but he definitely gave me that first chance.
What was the timeline from when you came back to China, when you came to live in China, to where you started working for the New York Times? About how long was that?
Maybe like less than 3 years. So, or maybe 2 years, 2.5 years of going from English teaching to running around China for the U.S. publications.
So within 2.5 years, you went from being a English teacher, effectively,
Sure. Yep.
to being a legitimate journalist. What was
Yeah.
that like? That must have been a very exciting period for you, just learning all these new
It was.
things along the way. You were not a journalist. You didn't go to journalism school.
Yeah.
And within a couple of years, you were a legitimate journalist.
Yeah. And Howard and I were actually talking about this yesterday because of some of the news that was in Hong Kong that was happening on
Mhm.
July 1st. But we were just chatting yesterday actually about how our time in China was quite special because Howard and I were there for the years that were building up to the Beijing Olympics, and and that meant we were super busy, and all the newspapers and magazines around the world were just budgeting more for China content and China stories because of the Olympics and because this was such a historic moment for China, like a coming out party, so to speak. So we were, we were the busiest bureau maybe in the world, and we were going out and telling stories about China, and it was a dream come true actually. Like, if I could still have that job, I might have never gone into television. Like,
Mm.
it was so much fun and so educational, and also too so important. Like, the amount of influence you have working for the New York Times and having people make policy decisions based on your work is such a huge responsibility. And it was so rewarding to get it right, like to go to these places in remote parts of China and really try to figure out what was actually going on, and then come back and be on the front page of the New York Times. Like, that reward system for me of putting in the hard work, digging deep, getting that story, and then coming out and sharing it with the world was like the most amazing high you could ever get. We loved it, and had there were tough days for sure, but it was wonderful to have that freedom to tell those stories.
Well, and then as you kind of alluded to, that time at one point did come kind of crashing to a halt.
Right.
I think it was the financial crisis of 2008. Is that right?
It was the combination of the Olympics and the financial crisis. So the buildup had been so big of people wanting China content that after the Olympics, people were kind of like China'd out, and
Mm.
people just didn't want stuff from China. And I had been like the China guy, and people didn't hire me from Shanghai and send me to India. They had someone else in India. Like, I was the China guy. So for 4 years there, 4 or 5 years there, I was so busy and loving it. And then of course, the financial model of newspapers changed drastically from 2005, 6, 7, 8, with advertising and classified ads going online, and no longer being in newspapers. So that killed the revenue stream of newspapers. And then what the financial crisis did in September 2008, which has just wiped out newspapers completely, as well as several other industries. So this kind of combination of all these things meant that I was working 3 times a week as a freelancer for 2 or 3 days at a time, making great money. And then I went to like literally doing nothing for months on end.
Wow.
And that was when I decided, like, I needed to mix it up and change what I was doing if I wanted to continue traveling and meeting people and telling stories.
Well, I think this is another kind of pivot point in your life. You know, you went from sports, that was your whole life and you were loving it, and then that came to an end. And then you found this whole new path at some point with travel and journalism. And then your career, as it was, effectively came to an end. How did you make the leap from being a pretty traditional journalist to doing what you do now? What was the transition?
It was terrible, like just awful, because no one helps you, right? Like I thought because I had such a unique and interesting career telling stories about China that people would let me do that and make television, and that's not the case at all. So I had never produced a TV show, I'd never directed a TV show, and I had never hosted a TV show. So no one gave me any chances. No one wanted to let me into the little circle of making TV that people hold so dear. Um, and it was just super frustrating. So I had all these ideas about content that I wanted to make and stories that I wanted to tell, and I had no outlet. So eventually I kind of just bit the bullet and said, well, I could either go to like film school or I could just make something myself and see how that plays out. So what I decided to do was ride a motorcycle around China and show people how kind of amazing China is, because I had also felt that in my journalism career, the stories about China were quite repetitive. You know, some story would be, in the New York Times, and then, 8 months later, some magazine in Germany would ask you to go and do the same story or something similar. So, like, I just felt like the Western media wasn't getting China right, or wasn't always going as far as they could. So what I wanted to do is just show this trip around China and show people just how diverse and interesting China was, which is exactly what I did when I made my first trip in 2001. So I
You
basically
kind of
followed
recreated your journey to some degree.
100% and with the same enthusiasm. And I felt like no one was doing this and no one was sharing these kinds of stories, because see, like, television production companies really destroy television, because what they try to do is they just try to make, in a lot of cases, and this is just the way business is they try to take money in from the broadcaster, make the show for as little money as possible, and then give back a product. And what's happened over time is maybe when you and I grew up, I'm over 40, but National Geographic was made these beautiful television shows about nature and life and culture, and I grew up on that. And then that in my mind was what a travel show was. And then what had happened, in the early 2000s and 2010, 2015, travel was now like, let's send some guy who doesn't know anything out with one cameraman and just record how stupid he is. And that was like travel television. And I wanted to bring something back. Like, I wanted to bring the educational element, I wanted to bring the quality back. I
Well, I'm just
wanted to
curious if I could,
host.
let me interrupt for a second. Sorry. What you're saying is true. Television did become kind of formulaic. Was there
Right.
was there anybody out there doing it differently that you kind of looked up to, that you kind of admired? Somebody who was not necessarily following the status quo?
No,
Literally no one.
no. I love Bear Grylls,
Mhm.
but he's totally different than what I do, and
Yeah.
he's more of an educator. Like, this is what to do in this situation, and I didn't want to do that, and I wouldn't know how to do that because that's not what I do, and I'm not that knowledgeable. Um, and I didn't want to eat bugs and drink my own urine and stuff like that. And he's built up a wonderful franchise and a career for himself. But I was, yeah, there was no one really doing the kinds of shows I wanted to make. There was um what's his name? Uh, so there is one guy that I really loved. His name's Michael Wood, and he's a professor at the University of Manchester in England, and he has been making documentary television for the BBC for like 30 years.
Mhm.
And he did the story of Shakespeare, 8 1-hour episodes. He did the story of India, which was like 6 1-hour episodes. So he does these huge, but he's traveling during that time and he's educating people. And I just loved his tone. And I love the way he just was so enthusiastic and so honest and so authentic with his desire to be places and tell stories. And I kind of wanted to be something like that, but without necessarily the education background, and just kind of enjoy traveling and share that with people. And that's just kind of what I wanted to do. And it wasn't like when I'm on camera or whatever, I'm not consciously thinking I need to be a certain way. I just kind of am. What you see is what you get. And I was lucky it kind of just worked out.
Yeah, it does work. It does work. It works well. And that first trip that you talked about, that was Tough Rides China, I believe, right?
That was, yeah.
And that was with your brother.
I was with my brother. We rode a motorcycle all the way around China, starting in Shanghai, up to the border with China and North Korea, and then straight across China to the border of China and Pakistan, and then all through Tibet. And we actually rode our motorcycles all the way to Mount Everest Base Camp. And we did the same path I walked, a decade earlier or 9 years
A little
earlier,
easier on a
and
motorcycle.
much easier on a motorcycle. And then back around past Shenzhen, Guangzhou, up to Shanghai. It was 65 days and about 18,000 kilometers. And that was the first TV show we put together. And it was great, but it was hard, because we were spending our own money, which was exhausting and very stressful. And of course, we didn't know what we were doing, so we made a lot of mistakes. And then filming, when we finished filming, we didn't know what to do with it because we hadn't properly planned the post-production because we didn't know what we were doing. So we finished it and was like, okay, now what? And that's the worst way to make television. And of course, now I have a production company and I have editors and music composers and colorists and everything
Now
like
there's
that. And we
now
have a
there's more
nice,
outlets. It might be easier now, but back then it was probably very, very difficult.
yeah. So we were lucky to find an editor who was working on it for relatively, a reasonable price. And he and I worked on it really and kind of built this idea of what the show ended up looking like. So that was very lucky, I guess, but cost a lot of money and a lot of sleepless nights. But the experience was priceless. And actually, to be honest, a lot of television hosts don't produce their own content and don't come up with their own stories and don't do the research and everything like that. So I was really lucky because I wanted to be on camera and share my passion and enthusiasm for travel with people. But because no one would let me be on TV, I had to create my own TV. So I also learned how to produce and direct and what that looks like. And actually now I'm so thankful for that experience because now I kind of control my own little universe.
Yeah.
And I have my own company and I choose where I go and I choose well, this is pre-COVID, right? So now everything's kind of fucked up again. But I used to be able to kind of do all that, and it was wonderful.
Awesome. So that has led to a career of doing kind of similar projects, I guess. I mean, they're all a bit different in their theme and in where you go and what exactly you're doing. But it's basically adventure travel television for you. I think you have a few other things going as well, but primarily that's what you do. What kind of new projects do you have coming up, maybe later down the road after this whole COVID thing blows over?
I don't know if it's going to blow over. Like, I just don't know how we're all going to trust each other to travel again. And waiting for a miracle vaccine and then somehow inoculating 7 billion people. I don't know. Like, I spent, so 2019 was an amazing year for me personally. I think we spent more than 250 days filming and I did 50 speaking events.
Mm.
And I was on the road all the time and I was loving it. And we filmed in Philippines, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, Mongolia, Taiwan, Thailand, Kyrgyzstan, India, and Hong Kong. And in between that, I was doing speaking events in Europe and the Middle East. And I also moved to Dubai. And that, I don't think that'll ever happen again or in the next 5 years or whatever, because I just don't see us all continent by continent, country by country, behaving in a way where everyone can trust everyone again now that we have this new thing. So I would like to keep filming extreme treks because it's a wonderful way to social distance. I love sleeping in a tent. I love climbing and trekking and doing all kinds of stuff. But and I'm kind of refocusing that on filming in Europe because I can't get on a plane and go to Brazil. I can't get on a plane and go to South Africa. I can't, China's closed for a long time. It's crazy. I've spent like a decade now setting myself up as being this like global travel adventurer,
Yeah.
and now it's all kind of come to to a head. And maybe, maybe this is another pivoting point, like the financial crisis was with my photography career. Maybe, global travel is going to be very difficult again.
Well, you've been
And I
stuck
don't
in
know how that's
quarantine. You've been stuck in
for
quarantine
100.
for 100 days. Have you given any
Yeah.
thought to that? Like, what if you just can't return to that life? Just like
Yeah.
journalism, this life that you grew to love. What if you can't return to it? Have you thought about what you might do? How you might kind of modify what you're doing or try some different things?
Well, I think like the world is going to open up in like bubbles, right? So like Europe will open up to Europeans, and maybe Asia will open up to Asians, and there's going to be all this like regionalism. So I'm just going to keep trying to do what I'm doing, but make it more regional. So if I can get into Europe, maybe I'll make an Extreme Trek season all about Europe. And then if I can get back to Asia next year or whatever, I can make a whole thing just about Asia, and work within these bubbles until things are easier. That's kind of my idea. With regards to like changing industries or evolving out of what I do now, I don't think I'm going to change what I'm doing, because I think people still want to be entertained. I still think people want to watch television. I think now more than ever, people want to watch my travel shows. And actually, I've just had this Discovery Channel just came out with my show that I filmed last year during lockdown, and the ratings have been huge because everyone's stuck at home and want to travel and they can't. So they've been watching me do it on television. So it's been nice that people during lockdown have been able to see what we've done
Well, I've done a bit of
previously.
that as well. I've watched a few of your shows, and it's kind of nice to live vicariously through you while we're all stuck at home and unable to get
Yeah.
on a plane and go to all these interesting places. Well, Ryan, I hope you're not stuck in Turkey for too much longer. I hope you're able to get out there and get back to what it is you love doing and sharing it with the world. This has been a
Thank you.
great talk. I want to thank you very much for joining me on Meet My Inspiration.
All right. Thanks so much. Take care.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks to Ryan for this great talk. His story is such a perfect example of adversity leading to growth and positive change through hard work and perseverance. Don't wait for success. Go create it. If you want to find out more about Ryan, you can visit ryanpyle.com or find him on all major social media platforms at Ryan Pyle. That's RyanPyle. I'd also recommend going to YouTube, where many of his shows are available right now. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Meet My Inspiration, and I hope we've been able to inspire you too, even if just a little. Sometimes that's all it takes to make great things happen. Using the internet without ExpressVPN is like broadcasting to the world everything you do online. Here's how to protect yourself and get 3 months for free. Did you know that your internet service provider knows every single website you visit? And what's worse is they can sell this information to ad companies and tech giants who will use your data to target you. ExpressVPN creates a secure encrypted tunnel between your device and the internet so that your online activity can't be seen by anyone. ExpressVPN works on all devices, phones, laptops, even routers, so that everyone who shares your Wi-Fi is protected too. And the best part is using ExpressVPN is super easy. Just fire up the app, click one button, and you're protected. ExpressVPN is the world's #1 rated VPN by TechRadar, Wired, The Verge, and countless others. So if you believe your online activity is your business, secure yourself by visiting expressvpn.com/MMI, and you can get an extra 3 months for free. That's expressvpn.com/MMI.